Welcome back to Writing and Reading the Declaration of Independence. In this talk we'll be looking at the Stamp Tax Act of 1765, but before that it's worth spending a few words on the British government. Great Britain was a constitutional monarchy, not by any means a tyranny. That government had been in place since the Glorious Revolution of 1688. Taxes originated in the House of Commons, and at least in theory, every Englishman was represented in that house. Now, in practice, only perhaps 5% of the male population had the right to vote, and politics was rough and tumble with an undeniable amount of corruption in the electoral process. We'll see a little of that in a future talk when we address the Middlesex Petition. There was a great degree of freedom of speech and freedom of the press. You could print pretty much whatever you wanted as long as you avoided libel, and of course you did not directly criticize the monarch. Domestic and colonial newspapers and pamphlets were outspoken in criticizing the government. The government felt the need for a stamp tax because they had accrued a substantial debt in successfully fighting the French in the 7 Years' War from 1758 to 1763. That was a consequence of war back then, just as it is now. The home government felt that the colonials had benefited from the war. After all, the threat of French-sponsored Indian attacks had been removed. The colonials, for their part, felt that the home government had benefited greatly. Quebec had been ceded to Great Britain, and British hegemony had been extended into the Orient. Besides, the colonials maintained they had provided troops and supplies. Now, there was debate in the House of Commons before the tax was passed, although it was passed overwhelmingly. But during the debate, the interests of the colonies had some support. In particular, Colonel Isaac Barré was outspoken. Barré had served in the army in Canada during the 7 Years' War and knew the colonists personally. Here's part of what he had to say. "Were they planted by your care? No, your oppression planted them in America. They fled from your tyranny to a then uncultivated and unhospitable country. Were they nourished by your indulgence? No, they grew by your neglect of them. As soon as you began to care about them, that care was exercised in sending persons to rule over them, men whose behavior on many occasions has caused the blood of those sons of liberty to recoil within them." You see that phrase, the Sons of Liberty? That would find a home in the colonial resistance. Barré continued, "The people, I believe, are as truly loyal as any subjects the king has, but a people jealous of their liberties, and who will vindicate them if ever they should be violated. But the subject is too delicate, and I will say no more." The strength of those words of Barré would find reflection in colonial writings, including those of Jefferson and Paine. Returning to the Stamp Tax Act, the idea was that anything printed would be taxed, and proof of payment would be the stamp printed on the paper. This actually extended beyond paper and onto parchment, skin, or vellum. There was to be a tax of anywhere from a few pence to a few pounds on everything that would be printed: licenses, deeds, surveys of lands, newspapers, pamphlets, even on playing cards and dice. And there would be customs agents and duty collectors to enforce them. Practically speaking, the 125 paragraphs and 13,000 words of the Act were unenforceable by any 18th century government. The Act could only lead to resistance and bureaucratic confusion. The colonists saw the Act as an economic and constitutional threat. They had no representation in the House of Commons, and so were being taxed without their consent. They were thus being treated as second-class Englishmen. The taxes had to be paid in specie, that is, in coins, not in the paper money printed by the colonies. But there was and there had been a serious lack of specie in the colonies, and that made trade, domestic and foreign, very difficult. The tax would suck specie out of the colonies. Customs agents would be installed, but the problem with that was, or a problem, was that the smuggling trade was widespread and profitable. Agents would be a real pain. In addition to that, the home government had claimed that it could pass and enforce any tax it wanted on the colonies. That threatened self-government and was, you would think, the last straw. In response, the colonists organized a Stamp Tax Act Congress. It was not particularly effective, but it did give activists from all over the colonies a chance to meet and talk. The British government changed prime ministers, and the new one recognized that the tax was an all-around bad idea. The tax never actually went into effect, being revoked in just 4 months. The net effect was an utter failure for the home government. The colonists had learned that joint action could achieve success, and that would be a continuing source of inspiration to the American movement to independence.